Severe floods in the Horn of Africa have claimed scores of lives and caused a large-scale displacement in Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia. The disaster has intensified an already dire humanitarian situation in a region where millions need aid. Save the Children Regional Humanitarian Policy Manager Musavengana Chibwana is with us for more. Musavengana, I appreciate your time on Africa Today. Now, let's talk a little bit about the overview of the current humanitarian situation in the Horn of Africa. Following the severe floods, what are the primary challenges faced by displaced families in Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia?
Thank you, Hugo, for having me on your program. Yes, like the intro that you mentioned is outlined. Indeed, there are devastating floods in East Africa, where we have witnessed mortality of more than 100 people, including 16 children, with more than 770,000 people displaced by the rains, with no sign of slowing down. We're anticipating that these rains are going not going to relent, are going to remain until December thereabout. So we do have a humanitarian crisis, which is compounded by other already existing underlying issues such as conflict in Somalia and Ethiopia, as well as 5 seasons of no rain in the region, which was getting us to a near point of famine. So this is what we are contending with. And in central Somalia, for example, in a city called Beledweyne, the city was completely submerged by the floods, and with 90% of the people living there, which is about 250,000 people, losing their houses, leaving their homes because they were submerged in water. And this is the crisis that Somalia is dealing with. And as a result, more than 33 people, including 8 children, have been killed. So we have witnessed a lot of displacement in East Africa. In Kenya, we have witnessed more than 136,000 people being displaced. And in Somalia, the broader number went, we have witnessed more than 1.7 million people being displaced. And in Ethiopia, it's at least 760,000 people displaced. That's one of the many challenges that we are contending with. The other one is the disruption of the sources of livelihood for these people who have been displaced. And in Somalia, we are anticipating that the food insecurity is going to rise from 3.7 million to 4.3 million people who would be needing food. And then in Kenya, one of the critical issues that have affected the country, which also affects Ethiopia and Somalia, is the death of livestock. We know that livestock is a form of wealth, is a source of wealth and well-being for the people, especially on the continent of Africa, and we've seen the floods sweeping away their livestock, and their livelihoods also have been affected. It's another challenge that we are dealing with, and extensive loss of farmland in all these countries. So food insecurity is inevitable unless international attention is put to it. Infrastructural damage. Some bridges have been swept away, which means the food system supplies have been disrupted, making the prices of basic commodities to go up. So, yeah, there is a lot of challenges that we have to contend with. But also I want to speak to the impact of the flooding to education, because the infrastructure in the education sector has been affected. So some schools have been closed. For example, in Kenya, 1,215 schools have been affected, which means children are not able to access education within these communities. And also the rising cholera cases and measles and malaria, because people have been moved from their households and they are now staying in temporary shelters. They are now prone to all these diseases. For example, in Somalia, the caseload for cholera is increased by 56% over the average of the last 3 years, and 4.3 million people in Somalia are at risk of hunger because of the challenges that we're mentioning. Yeah.
Now, those numbers, are pretty scary. They're daunting. But the one thing that obviously compounds the challenges that an organization like Save the Children has is the fact that there were already in Somalia alone over 795,000 people that had been displaced by the war. Now, how does that affect or impact the ability to offer humanitarian assistance when you've got these almost a million, a little shy of three-quarters of a million people in this particular part of the continent that have been displaced as a result of war, and then soon after they're hit by these floods?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you are right. Save the Children has been working in the Horn of Africa for the last 70 years. And just in 2022, we reached more than 14.7 million people, including 9.6 million children. So we have been working in these areas. What we are doing in response to the crisis is to escalate and to increase, to ramp up the humanitarian support that we have already been providing. For example, in all the three countries in question, we are disseminating early warning information to the local communities for them to be ready to be evacuated when the flooding starts. We are also scaling up our health and nutrition services in the places where the families have been relocated. We are distributing health information and services such as the oral cholera vaccine. We're scaling up our preparedness activities for cholera outbreaks throughout the procurement and supplies and training of the community health workers in responding to cholera, measles, and malaria, because those are what we are anticipating to be forthcoming. We have been distributing dignity kits to several households, and we have also been responding to the destruction of the infrastructure by constructing emergency latrines, because some of these latrines have affected freshwater sources. That's why there is this cholera pandemic also. We have also been rehabilitating health and nutritional facilities that have been impacted by the floods in the region, and we are distributing mosquito nets to the temporary shelters that we have also been supporting with. And also we have been providing safe drinking water, because it's one of those challenges that the communities and the households that have been moving to safe areas have been facing, that they do not have safe water. And also we have been supporting with the vaccination of the livestock that have survived, that have not been swept away. So in a nutshell, we have been involved in a lot of interventions to support, to mitigate the impact of the floods on the communities.
Now, a lot of the work that you describe is about offering these individuals that are struggling because of these disasters an opportunity to lead lives as normal as possible. In fact, for many of them, it's about survival. But let's talk about psychosocial support, particularly for the children, because it's got to be extremely traumatic to leave where you live because of war. So you chased out. A lot of these children are unable to go to school, unable to play as children should. And then all of a sudden you hit by these floods. What is the mental state of these young people, and do you offer any assistance in this regard?
Thank you for raising this question. I think it's one of the challenges that we are facing when the ecosystem of livelihoods are destroyed, in that the children are the most vulnerable. Once we know that they are the most vulnerable, we also know that our children on the continent are very resilient to some of these challenges. So indeed, our child protection interventions include an element of addressing issues of mental health and psychosocial support to make sure that children can at least get a resemblance of their childhood back by when you are putting in play centers where they can at least relieve some of that stress. We have been providing the necessary support through counseling to the children and their households so that they can be able to cope with the challenges that they are facing in this difficult time. So indeed, the issue of mental health is very important, but also, since it's not one that is easily quantifiable, we are calling on donors and international partners to invest more in child protection, especially when we're dealing with humanitarian crises, because sometimes the default position is to respond to the quantifiable needs, such as building of latrines, such as building of the infrastructure that would have been destroyed, without looking at what I would call the software, where the people have been traumatized by the experience. So there is need for more investment in mental health and psychosocial support to make sure that our services are even reaching more children that are in need of support. Because right now, there are several deficits in our interventions. For example, in Somalia, our humanitarian response plan is only funded to 39%, which means if we were to prioritize, there are some emergent issues that we need to respond to, which have a life and death element to it. And meanwhile, the issues of mental health and psychosocial support are equally important. Therefore, there is need for more resources to make sure that our humanitarian response plans are supported fully. In Kenya, for example, so our humanitarian response plan is only supported to $600,000, and yet the plan itself in total is $3 million. So there is a huge deficit in funding in responding to the crisis that is obtaining in the Horn of Africa. And our call to action is for donors and international partners to prioritize the Horn of Africa. We know, of course, there are other conflicts and humanitarian crises happening in other parts of the world, but there is need to make sure that also resources are allocated to such kind of crises, because also those lives matter.
Well, there is a silver lining to all of this, Musavengana, and that for me has been the report received from the UNHCR, which speaks about refugees who have embraced those who've been displaced by flooding and accommodated them in some of those communities. Now, that is an absolutely remarkable thing. Speak to us about that.
Yeah. I think the spirit of Ubuntu does exist on the continent, even in the most of dire circumstances. But also we notice that these communities do have limited resources. They would therefore need to be supported, including their community organizations that they are working with. Because when we are supporting the community working organizations within those communities that are receiving or that are the host communities to refugees, we have a sustainable way of responding to crises rather than to have external players coming into wanting to support without building the capacity of the communities on resilience. So indeed, the spirit of Ubuntu does exist, but we need to support these communities to be able to provide all the requisite support needed for the refugees that would have crossed the border. In our country office in South Sudan, one of the regions that has been affected by the flooding has also been hosting some refugees and some returnees from Sudan. But also we are noticing that there's a double jeopardy on these refugees, because the same communities that are hosting are in precarity because they are not able to provide the necessary basic services and support that the communities do need. Therefore, both the refugees and the host communities are vulnerable.
Now, a little while ago, you talked about the $600,000 that you have in your budget or in your coffers against an actual budget of $3 million that is required, which speaks to the support that Save the Children is getting, because you're a global organization. Where are the priorities in supporting Africa when it comes to relief and some of these disasters that we're seeing? We've noticed in the past that in places like Ukraine, because of the Russia war, the amount of support globally has been massive. But there are a lot of challenges that the continent is facing, Africa that is, and there seems to be a disproportionate support.
Yeah, I think, thank you, Hugo, for this question. My starting point is to highlight that the primary duty bearer for the realization of rights for any jurisdiction is the state. The government has the primary obligation to provide for its citizens, and in such situations of humanitarian crisis, it is the obligation of the state to provide for its people. So when Save the Children comes into a community or into a country, it will be to complement the efforts of the state. So you have asked me what the priorities of my organization are when it comes to Africa.
Not so much your organization, but you're an organization that is obviously funded by a number of countries and communities, right? Are your funding requirements, I suppose is my question, proportionate to your needs versus what the rest of the world is getting when they're faced with similar catastrophes?
Yeah. We've witnessed at a global level, I think, what we would call humanitarian inequality, where certain conflicts receive more funding, maybe because of proximity, maybe because of their political relevance to especially the donor countries. I think that's understandable. But for us, our call is for the governments on the continent to invest a lot more resources into their populations, because some of the countries that we are talking about here are facing several threats. Some of them are humanitarian threats, others are also state security threats from terrorist attacks. But then we see that the prioritization more often is to state security, ramping up state security at the expense of human security. So whilst we might cry foul on the global distribution of humanitarian support, but perhaps we might do better as African governments by investing a lot more in human security, supporting our own people.
You make a fair point. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Musavengana Chibwana, Save the Children Regional Humanitarian Policy Manager, thank you so much for speaking to us on Africa Today.